This morning, we are here to discuss a very exciting initiative we just launched with some excellent partners, the World Bank Group and 2 South African parks. You will hear from them directly during this webinar this morning. My name is Avril Benchimol, and I lead the Blended Finance Initiative at the GEF, and today I'm moderating this session. The Rhino Bond, or officially as it's called, the Wildlife Conservation Bond, is a very innovative financial instrument that combines the excellent credit rating of the World Bank Group and, for the first time in history, the performance payment for bondholders that is linked directly to the survival of a species in the 2 parks of South Africa, the black rhino. This webinar is divided in 3 parts. First, we're gonna hear introductory remarks from 2 very distinguished speakers. Second, we will have a panel with excellent speakers, and I can't wait to hear from them. And third, we're gonna see from our communications teams the worldwide impact of an outreach of this Wildlife Conservation Bond. Let me now turn to our speakers for the opening remarks. First, with the most important person in the room, because he's my boss and the CEO of the GEF. He is also the former Minister of Environment of Costa Rica and has a long and distinguished career in conservation. He joined us at the GEF 2 years ago, I think this summer in August, and since then has led us to the biggest replenishment ever of the GEF. Second, we will hear from Dr. Valerie Hickey, the Global Director of Environment, Natural Resources, and Blue Economy, one of our main partners in this transaction, the World Bank Group. Valerie has a long and distinguished career at the World Bank Group, where she has held many managerial roles in multiple areas. We're honored to have them this morning, and without further ado, Carlos Manuel, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Abril, and good morning to everybody. Greetings from Costa Rica. Very, very happy to be here this morning, and yes, indeed, sharing with Valerie and her team from the World Bank on this very innovative conservation instrument. I think that above all many different challenges, one very concrete that we all need to really concentrate in the next, I would say, first 5 years of the new CBD framework. And I hope that we are able to really land on a very ambitious new framework for the CBD, which, by the way, is not going to be that different to what we already saw from 2010 to 2020 that we call the Aichi targets. And if you read any of the outlooks related to how countries were able to implement the Aichi target, there's a common denominator in the Aichi target that will be our next big challenge for the new CBD framework, which is how do we mobilize resources from all sources that can help us narrow, well, yes, the global financial gap, but most importantly, the domestic financial gap. And I think that this should be the context of today's conversation and how we've been able to really generate a breakthrough within the conservation community and the financial community. We've been talking for years on how do we get there. Yes, we've been talking about green bonds. We've been talking about developing other tools like, biodiversity offsets, and, Valerie with us is a world expert on this field. We're pushing the envelope further in innovative ways by which we can mobilize our resources. But 2 things are really, really important here, because this is what I strongly believe should be the context that we need to have very clear in order to make the best, maximize the opportunities of this innovative financial mechanism. And it is the following. The GEF can be 10 times, 20 times bigger. The World Bank can be 100 times bigger, that we won't have enough resources, blended resources, grant resources, soft loan. I mean, you can call it concessional, non-concessional, you can call it. We can be 100 times bigger than what we are. That won't be enough to really narrow the global financial gap if we keep on investing in activities and sectors that contribute, that destroy nature, and contribute to climate change. That's the real context. So in order to get there and be able to assist all countries in mobilize the domestic resources more efficiently, these kind of initiatives are extremely relevant and important. Well, South Africa is a leading nation in terms of the finance for biodiversity, and it's not a surprise that we have the Rhino Bond with them. Biofilm, the finances of biodiversity, has been working in South Africa for quite some time. Sandy, parks, in many different stakeholders has been able to generate many important and relevant information. And I think that South Africa is in the lead with regards to developing nations on implementing a financial plan to narrow the biodiversity financial gap. And that is extremely important. Having that plan is relevant. In order to have that plan, you need to have other elements which are relevant. One is all countries need to know how much are they investing in nature conservation. And that is not an easy task. If you don't know how much you are investing, you won't be able to really understand the gap and how to deal with that domestic gap. And most countries will be surprised when they do their biodiversity expenditure review that there are many different sectors investing in nature conservation that are not responding to the country's NBSAP. If we are able to do the biodiversity expenditure review, see who is investing in nature conservation, and do the political alignment of all sectors with the NBSAP, I will say that we will be really helping that country narrow their financial gap. And as you do that, you need to do the other homework, which is mapping all of those incentives and subsidies and financial instruments that keep on promoting economic activities that destroy nature, and began the hard, complex political process of phasing out all of those policies. So those are the two main tasks that I believe that should be done in that context. The Rhino Bond, the biodiversity bond, the blue bonds are playing a key role in the effort to narrow that financial gap, that domestic financial gap, and be able to help us assist those countries in what I will call the ultimate goal, which is having a system of protected areas, management of biodiversity that is financial, self-sufficient, financially speaking, that creates innovative mechanisms that makes them more resilient to fiscal crisis and political crisis, which has been always one of the major challenges. This is what I believe is the real context of what we're here looking here. I'm super excited to see how successful this financial mechanism has been as we look forward in GEF-8 to really expand the innovative approaches by which we will be helping countries with our larger GEF partnerships in ways that we can help them narrow that financial gap and be at the end of 2030 in a much better situation than what we are right now, where we are. If you saw the latest IPBES report, we're not doing very good. And at the end of the day, we need to mobilize financial resources more efficiently from all sources. And this is in the center of that main challenge. So with this, I would like to thank you so much and pass it over to you, April.
Thank you, Carlos Manuel. And I would like to now give the floor to Dr. Valerie Hickey. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Avril. And excuse me, I apologize for calling in a few minutes late, but my computer is protesting the return to the office and I was struggling to get it to work. So I apologize, but it's very fitting that I come after Carlos Manuel, because for the past 15 years, I've apprenticed at the knee of Carlos Manuel, learning all about resource mobilization for the CBD, for conservation. And this hasn't been an easy task. We sat together during the process towards and after Aichi, Carlos Manuel, to think about, as part of a high-level panel, how do we finance conservation? And it was never easy. And we talked about, just as Carlos Manuel did, the importance of public domestic finances, something we don't talk about enough. International public financing, and of course, private capital And Carlos Manuel is right that there is not enough money. There's also a lot of money that's not aligned. This isn't something we talk about. It's not the subject of today, but the fact that we hear there's an $800 billion gap for conservation, and at the same time, there's $800 billion in perverse subsidies, speaks to me about the fact that maybe it's not always about there not being enough money, but that the money we have isn't being spent right. And that's why this idea of biodiversity expenditure reviews is such an important one and such an innovative one. I'm very proud that at the bank, one of the things we're doing, Carlos Manuel, and we'll be very happy to share the methodology as we advance, is that we're actually coming up with our own methodology to measure nature positive spending at the bank. So we can identify, do our own biodiversity expenditure review. What are we doing that's nature positive? How can we count that? How can we make sure we're capturing all of the benefits? But today we're here to talk about the Wildlife Conservation Ban. And I do want to say a huge thank you to Carlos Manuel and the entire team at the GEF, of course, to the government of South Africa, to Conservation Alpha, to the Zoological Society of London, Credit Suisse, Citi. It does take a village. Multilateralism and partnership has never been more important than at the moment, where the loss of biodiversity anywhere, emissions produced by forests falling anywhere is leading to sea level rise everywhere and more people being pushed into poverty. So working in partnership has never been more important. And this bond is something that has helped me answer questions that I get all the time, whether I'm talking to partners, whether I'm talking to clients, whether I'm talking to community elders, which is, how do we move from the billions to the trillions that we always talk about? How do we bring private capital to the table? What's stopping them from investing? Carlos Manuel is absolutely correct. Even if the World Bank, with the $70 billion we invest every year, was to do 10 times as much, even if the GEF, with the record-breaking replenishment that Carlos Manuel oversaw this past year, was to do 10 times as much, it's not anywhere close to the amount of capital that the private sector can bring to the table. Just the institutional investors, the highly regulated capital that sits in pension funds, is $56 trillion a year. That's trillion with a T, and that's growing at 10% every year. That's the money that we need to begin to tap. I'm Irish. That's the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And the question has always been, how do we tap it? How do we make use of it? How do we use grant financing to de-risk the biodiversity sector, to bring that private capital to the table? And how do we move from input-based financing, which has led to this epidemic of boom and bust financing, where we provide financing for a project 2 or 3 years later after the project is closed, the results have eroded, nothing is left behind. How do we stop that boom and bust financing and really move from green projects to greening economies so that we can actually address the triple environmental crisis of climate change, pollution, and the loss of biodiversity? And this wildlife conservation bond begins to put real answers on the table with real money. And it does it in a way that is quite genius, because it does it in a way that doesn't add to South Africa's debt. That's extremely important at a time when we know many, many countries are getting into debt distress because of the havoc that COVID has wreaked with public finances and, of course, public health. But it did more. It transfers the financial risk from the public sector to the private sector. And even though it's results-based, it provides money up front as well. So there isn't a case of the missing middle, something that we've seen really cause havoc with the REDD+ financing, which is a wonderful results-based instrument that hasn't worked particularly well, in part because we've promised governments, we've promised communities that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, but for them to produce the emissions reductions, they can't, because we haven't provided financing for that. So again, this wildlife conservation bond doesn't have a problem with that missing middle. But it does still leave me with some questions, and this is what I'm going to be listening for today. The first question really is, how can we begin to autopsy this bond to really understand the price and the cost of it and the conditions under which it worked? What brought private capital to the table? How were we able to capture a part of the supply? And how do we create a part of the demand? And how do we create the supply? What are the regulations? What's the institutional credibility that's needed for that supply of private capital to see a pipeline of bankable investments? So how do we get supply and demand to meet? What does that look like? And really understand from this wildlife conservation bond, what happened? How did it work? Where was the magic made? How do we avoid this becoming niche? Something I've always worried about, particularly after, again, the GEF, together with us and other partners, were at the forefront of launching the first blue bond almost 7 years ago. It didn't necessarily lead to immediate replication and scale up in ocean finances. Why not? What is it about some of these projects that we can do once, but struggle to replicate? How can we make sure the WCB, the Wildlife Conservation Bond, the Rhino Bond is different? How do we replicate the partnerships that came together? And if these partnerships are expensive and bespoke to create, does the cost of the bond outpace our ability to deliver on a cheaper price? What does that look like? How do we build these partnerships? How do we make sure they exist and we can continue creating that pipeline of investable projects that can be met by the supply of capital, particularly among the institutional sector? How do we create the KPIs, the results indicators that attract private capital? And how do we do it in a way, again, learning from the failures of REDD+, where you have a multiplicity of monitoring results and verification systems that are expensive and obtuse, and that have meant that many communities are priced out of creating the KPIs necessary to attract private capital. So how do we do it differently in the biodiversity space so that there's a single set of KPIs and a single MRV that everybody can sign up to that doesn't siphon money away from actually doing the work of conservation? So that's what I'm going to be listening for today, Avril, and we're just so proud to be part of this partnership. So back to you.
Thank you very, very much, Valerie and Carlos Manuel, for your opening remarks. I have never before started a panel with a Q&A session at the top, but I think, Valerie, you already set the tone to what are some of the questions we're going to try to respond in this panel, and if not, we hope that we will cover that in the Q&A. But now, so without further ado, and since you've heard a bit from me at the beginning, I wanted to turn to our panel today. I'm very excited to introduce the 4 panelists that are going to help us dissect, or what we heard from Valerie, how we're going to be able to really understand this transaction so that it can be not a niche transaction, but something replicable that for us, but also for other partners that may be listening to us. So let me turn to first Ms. Eleanor Vandenberg McGregor. I'm going to ask each of the 4 panelists to introduce briefly themselves before we enter into the panel itself. So Eleanor, please go ahead. Thanks.
Thank you, Avril. Good afternoon, everybody. It's 3:30 in South Africa. Am I audible? Thank you. My name is Eleanor Vandenberg McGregor. I work for the Eastern Cape Parks and Tourism Agency, and I'm the Director for Biodiversity and Conservation in the province. And I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor. Next, we will have Mr. Nick de Gode from also another park in South Africa. Nick.
Good afternoon, everyone, and morning to those in the other part of the world. I am Nick de Goede. I am the park manager for South African National Parks, managing the Addo Elephant National Park, which is one of the 2 sites that was selected in South Africa. For those who don't know, we live in South Africa. We got load shedding, so signal might come and go. So I will switch my camera off once we start the discussions, just so we do not lose signal. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Nick. Next, we will have Mr. Ellison Wright.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Avril. And just wanted to also say, as Valerie has mentioned, thank you so much for all of the partners and everybody who is engaged on this. And many are on this call, but there are many others who are not. But it's been a big team effort. My name is Ellison Wright. I'm part of Valerie's team there in the global unit, the World Bank. I'm a senior environmental finance specialist and the TTL for this project, supporting the agencies in implementing this work.
Thank you, Ellison. And last but not least, Faye, please come.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Fei Wang. I'm from the World Bank Treasury Department. I'm very glad to be part of the team that went through the whole wildlife conservation bond structuring and issuance process. Very glad to be here today.
Thank you, Fei. Thank you, everyone, for being here. So I'm going to turn first to Alison for the first question. The GEF, as you know, had been exploring this wildlife conservation bond for more than a decade. We not only have been partners of you in this issuance of the bond, but we started with a small project a decade ago to basically look at the parks and look at the financial structures that would address some of the barriers in financing conservation that were mentioned by Carlos Manuel and also Valerie Hickey before. So then we needed you, actually. We ended up partnering with you in order to get this project to the finish line, which is issuing the bond and starting with the financing of the conservation activities from the money coming from the bondholders in capital markets. Can you explain the World Bank Group involvement from the operational side, but also its interaction with the World Bank Group Treasury that Fei here represents?
Certainly, Avro. And again, thanks to you and all the other colleagues, because obviously none of this would have been possible if those prior project outcomes had not been achieved in all those investments and efforts. So there are a lot of very good activities that went underway for years. So I personally heard about the bond and the effort that the team was trying to do back in 2016 in Skukuza at the African Rhino Specialist Group meeting. When it was presented there, they were looking at the different sites and trying to see what was going to be done. And we talked with the project team there over the years, just about, can the bank be involved? How can we be involved? And what are some ways? So ultimately, there wasn't a very good fit because, again, our team, we work with governments and we support them. We do several, call it pay for result type of, operations. But in this case, the idea was that there was going to be a bond and it was going to go directly to the parks and some, private conservancies in Kenya, because initially out of the 130 sites, it was going to include 5 sites, 3 in Kenya, 2 in South Africa. So we were looking at how to make this work and how we can play. And thankfully, there was a lot of interest across the World Bank operations side, as well as in the Treasury team. But it wasn't until 2019, late 2019, when several colleagues were able to come together. And I really have to thank Natalie Johnson and Edith Miwa and Ian Africa, many other colleagues who really pushed the envelope here to make sure that we stayed engaged. And we were able to explore different options. So the bank, we usually implement projects, as do many other GEF implementing agencies, on these issues. Okay, but the Treasury, they're leaders in sustainable development bonds and really raising capital for the bank to do its business. We have some experience working together across the operations and the Treasury side, but this is the first project where it's getting funds directly from a bond that's issued by Treasury. So there was a lot of learning. There was a lot of kind of communication that had to come along. And I'll put a list here of some of the colleagues that were engaged internally, but it is a very long list of colleagues across, the accounting group, across legal, and our colleague Jorge and Sharmila and others. They were instrumental in getting this legal agreement to be, encompassing of both the typical grant side of the operation, as well as the funds that were coming in from the foregone coupons, which Fei is going to explain a little bit later. So that was really key. So ultimately, I think from our side, we were able to win over a lot of support, and at the end of the day, thanks to everybody who was here and others. But certainly Valerie, Africa, and many others here, we were able to get the managing directors and the president really to champion this bond and to want to replicate it. So I think from the operations side, we're very excited to try to do more. First, make sure this one is a very big success, and then already try to replicate it in a much shorter time frame and with greater scale going forward. So I'll stop there, but thank you, Ava.
Thank you, Alison. And that is a very good leeway to the next question for Fei. because before diving into the details of the transaction and the pricing that a lot of our speakers before, and also I'm sure participants are interested in, can you just give us a little bit of a background on how and why the World Bank wanted to issue from the Treasury side, wanted to issue this wildlife conservation bond in the broader context of other SDG bonds that you do, and how this was different from previous efforts? Thank you.
Sure, thank you, April. I'm very happy to address this point. First of all, I want to mention that at IBRD Treasury, we manage bond issuance for quite a few different entities. IBRD, IDA, IFM, International Finance Facility for Immunization. And we also helped UNICEF actually to access capital market last year. So issuing bond, obviously, it's our broader mandate. Through capital market, we bring in finances to help various organizations to be able to meet their operational objectives. At the same time, global capital market is huge. The bond market itself is more than $100 trillion outstanding bonds there. So there's certainly a lot of resources there. So how to engage investors from the private capital, from the private sector, from capital market has always been something that we're very interested in. And so back in 2008, for example, we issued the first labeled green bond. The very incentive or idea behind that is actually to engage investors so that they not only look at the risk and the returns in the investment decision-making process, but they also sort of factor in the impact, the ESGs and the later SDGs into their investment decision-making, because that's not only more financial resources, but also when we at a stage where the investment, maybe later on, the consumption behaviors are also driven by the considerations of the social impact, the environmental impact. That's where you create a very positive circle that is feeding into itself, driving everybody to look into ways they can make impact, they can contribute to the impact. So that's the overall goal that we're trying to achieve, not just to issue bonds in the capital markets to bring finances to support operations, but hopefully to engage investors, and hopefully they more and more considering the impact that their money are going to. And that's actually what we have seen from the investor space. I mean, from the beginning, it was the green bond ring-fenced portfolios impact reporting just for the green bond portfolio, but later on, now ourselves we're labeling pretty much all our bonds under the umbrella of sustainable development bond, so that we're showing investors holistically what we're doing as an issuer, everything else we do. And we see investors are not only demanding the impact reporting for the specific bond, the use of proceeds, a lot of them start to look into what the organization is doing, what not only their green bond, but also the other bonds they issue are supporting. And some investors are even more advanced than that. They're very interested in getting into exposure to very specific projects. They want to be part of it. They're happy to take the risk, and they want to see the result, obviously. So with that, obviously, the outcome-based bond, it was a great structure for us to sort of because it offers, in addition to the sort of the general sustainable development bond, it offers that opportunity for investors to participate in those specific projects where there's a very measurable outcome, there's a very specific impact they're making through their investment into this particular bond. So that's why we are always interested in exploring different ways to structure bonds, to engage investors, but also to provide financing to such development projects. And we do see the outcome-based bond, the wildlife conservation bond, to be replicable and to be actually could be applicable to other sectors, to other development projects. I think that at this time, the benefit of the bond is that it has triggered such a wide interest from the investors. I mean, some of them were not able to participate for whatever reasons, but anyhow, it triggered a a point for them to start thinking, now, how come I couldn't participate in this one? How come the other investors in the press release, they can do this? So we got a lot of interest from investors now asking, what's your pipeline? Is there anything else you're thinking about? So certainly there's a very positive outcome from this bond issuance. Maybe let me just stop here, but I just want to echo maybe address some of the questions before that. We certainly would like this to be a more sort of a widely accepted financial instruments. Certainly want to avoid just creating a very specific financial instrument that works for one time. But I think there's a general structure here that's readily replicable to the other areas in the development.
Thank you so much, Hey, and it's so great to hear that what we're seeing increasingly in the capital markets is specific interest in the environment or the SDG overall, but more specifically on specific outcomes and the investors being an active part, as we will see in the structure that we're going to explain a bit later in the project. But on the specifics, and now that we get a bit more concrete, I wanted to turn to the parks. First to Mr. De Gode to run us through so that we can understand how we designed, or later when Ellison goes through the financial structure, how the financial structure responds to the challenges that we can find on the ground at conservation level. So Nick, could you please run us through the wildlife challenges of your parks and how this project came to be? I understand you were involved in an earlier GEF project that did set the ground, the project I mentioned before that was led some years ago by UNDP, and you therefore have been here for a long time. So please tell us what are these challenges and how you think this transaction can respond to them.
Thanks very much, Avril. Thanks for the opportunity. As we mentioned with all of us, we're all very excited about this project, and we're definitely out there to make this a success. So yeah, we've been involved together with the Great Fish River Nature Reserve and Addo, been part of this for the whole duration of when the project started off as the Rhino Impact Investment Project. We started off way in 2016, and we were lucky to be selected as one of or both of us as the 2 sites in South Africa from the potential 144 sites that was selected in South Africa, Kenya, and Zimbabwe. And obviously those 3 countries consisted was probably of 50% of the black rhino population in Southern Africa. So I think that's where from the initial start with the GEF project, and then obviously with the greatest assistance of the Zoological Society of London as well, that was the main implementers in this project when we started off in 2017 when we were selected the 3 sites in Kenya and the 2 sites in South Africa. So we did participate, and I think these sites were mainly selected due to the sites' ecological, managerial, and financial capacity to be able to achieve rhino outcomes when we came to the stage where we are now currently with the rhino or the wildlife conservation bond. So going through the whole thing, MOU was signed, and then it actually was renamed the Rhino Impact Investment Readiness phase, where we received some funding, and it was mainly through ZSL, GEF, the Royal Foundation, and a couple of other partners in the process. And I think Conservation Alpha was also very instrumental in assisting both of the 2 parks as well as the 3 parks in Kenya to draw up a detailed theory of change, and then also a budget to be able to look at this theory of change. And then I think the most important thing out of all of this is to actually to be able to go into the bond phase. You need to know what you have for the outcome to say that the rhino will grow at a set percentage, which is 4% currently with the bond phase. So obviously, if you don't know what you've got, then you need to do it. So I mean, things from most of the wildlife challenges we have facing us in the park is probably, I don't think it's a surprise for anyone with the current rhino poaching that's happening in South Africa for the last couple of years. There's been tremendous threats on all parks that have rhino. So I think a lot of effort has gone into the management of rhino, but unfortunately for the parks in the past where they never used to be, there's a lot of array of other conservation tasks that also has to be fulfilled. So you can't just purely focus on the one on the law enforcement side and nothing on the other side. So I think that also assisted us tremendously with the bond that's been paid out for the management of it. And I don't think it could have come at a better time, as Valerie also alluded to, with the COVID pandemic that hit the world. So Sandparks, from our behalf, is 84% self-reliant, self-sustainable, and we only get a small 16% grant from government, and that's mainly through to tourism. So you can imagine through the COVID period, all of that stopped immediately, and unfortunately, with all the social impacts, it was, especially in South Africa, most of funds went to the social impacts, to the needs for the people of the country. So we couldn't get any more money than what we had. So for us, from a financial point of view, the bond is extremely needed, and it came exactly at the right time, just after COVID. Although we are in a process of getting a bit back to normal, but we know it's going to take at least 5 years to get where we were. So for us at Addo, we in the privileged position that we have not lost rhino, and at least with the financial backing that we get from the bond now, that will tremendously assist, as we've always tried to be, rather to be proactive than reactive. So we rather put in the measures in place before anything can happen with regard to poaching. As the saying is in South Africa, it's not if poaching will happen, it's only a case of when it will happen. We've seen the trends that happened in South Africa, moving from Kruger down towards the KZN. Currently, in the first couple of months in KZN, there's been chaos absolutely with that. So that's what we got to look at. Addo is also in a privileged position that we are surrounded by about 95% commercial farmers. And with the current drought and things in South Africa, most of them are taking strain. So the problem is that we have, which is a good problem currently in Addo, is that we are getting to a number that we've got too many rhino and we need to expand or either translocate. So we are purchasing land around it. As Carlos also mentioned, with this carbon sequestration, because of all the spat boom and things in the Eastern Cape, there's a lot of interest in Addo and also in purchasing land adjacent to the park for expansion, and that will obviously assist. So we know that the rhino is one of the key species. Addo's also got a lot of other species. We've got a big 7, not just the big 5. So we also got to try and manage that the competition with the species competition amongst themselves. So the bond will also assist, obviously not just for the rhino, but also for the management of the whole park and the wildlife in general. And then obviously one of the big components is, and I think that was the realization with the Kruger poaching, as well as in the KZN, and that is that you need to have a lot more benefit flowing to the local community surrounding the parks. Those are the people that lived in the areas for some of those areas in the years gone past. And if they don't see any value of the species within the park or for the park's existence itself, then we're definitely not going to win with conservation in Southern Africa or in Africa for that way. So with the financial barriers that we have, and also with the financial boost that we get through the bond phase now, that's also going to assist tremendously to empower the community, and there will also be a lot of opportunities for the community that will come out of this project. So that's just in short. Valerie, I'll just stop there for now.
Thank you, Nick, so much. So, and for this description of the many challenges in this specific time, and how good the timing was about the bond after the COVID-19, and how important it is, the need of financing for decreasing poaching, but also, as you were mentioning, how important it is that some of the proceeds that we're going to get into a bit later go to the local communities, who then get involved and committed to the survival of the species. So we have an alignment of interest and benefits for everybody on the ground. So, Eleanor, a little bit the same question for you, for in the specific context of ECPTA and how this project fits your strategic efforts.
Thank you, Avril. Apologies to the panel and to the participants. You'll notice that Nick and I, we're keeping our videos off. It's displaying unstable connection, so please indulge us. Thank you for the question. From the Eastern Cape Parks and Tourism Agency's perspective, perhaps a bit of context first. We are a very small conservation agency or entity, and when you compare us to other conservation entities in South Africa, and we have a very, very limited budget. Within this context, however, we are managing one of the largest black rhino populations in the country. In addition to that, it's also worthwhile sharing that this specific rhino population at the Great Fish River Nature Reserve is one of the most important donor populations in the country. So the habitat at Great Fish Nature Reserve is ideal for rhino management. We've got high densities and high growth rates of the rhino. But we are under no illusion, colleagues, that with our security measures that we have in place, but with security measures increasing elsewhere in the country and in our neighboring countries, and the fact that most other organizations are dehorning their animals, the radar of the poachers, it's very, very rapidly focusing towards our region. So the limited financial resources that we had, I will echo what Nick is saying. The Wildlife Conservation Bond has come at just the right time. I won't echo COVID and all the other things, but for this financial injection now, we probably would have been in a real difficult situation, because what we do is we tend to keep our ear on the ground to figure out what's happening from a poaching perspective. Obviously, we need to look at some intelligence gathering, etc. That's part of normal rhino population. And the risk for our region is amplifying for the reasons that I've mentioned. So risks that we have, very limited budget, increase in the rhino poaching risk. Now, having said that, it is extremely expensive to protect our rhino, and our state funding is very unlikely to increase, like Nick said, because we've got other basic requirements in South Africa: housing, clean water, schooling, etc. So it's not that the country doesn't care about conservation, but there's the slice or the pie is only so big. So we get the bit that we do get. With the insufficient funding, we needed to collectively in South Africa and globally, then we needed to start looking at other options, other possibilities, other innovations, other ideas, how we fund rhino conservation. So the Wildlife Conservation Bond is an excellent example of this collaboration, innovation, new novel idea of how we can fund species such as rhino and potentially other species and other conservation imperatives further down the line. So maybe a little bit of more strategic context for colleagues in South Africa. We've got a national biodiversity management plan for black rhinos, and the outcomes of that plan is twofold. The idea is that we need to manage our populations in a way where they grow. And then, very importantly, to save the species, we need to establish new rhino populations. So the fact that the Wildlife Conservation Bond is coming in now, assisting us to amplify our security management part of rhino population, as well as the monitoring part of it, the protection part of it, and ultimately then the growth part of it, that will help us to achieve our strategic objectives, which is one, manage them in a way so that they can grow, and two, start new rhino populations. Do not keep all your eggs in one basket. As a country, we've been implementing that plan since 2010, and without flogging a dead horse, money is the problem. This Conservation Bond initiative is an excellent initiative, and in terms of the agreement that we have with the Wildlife Conservation Bond, with ourselves, I do want to close off by saying, I'll speak a little bit about it later maybe, that Great Fish River Nature Reserve is in fact part owned by government and part owned by a local community. And when I say part owned, I mean that the community own a significant part of this park. So this investment is an investment into rhino conservation, but also into investment in a community who are actively assisting government to protect the rhinos. I'll stop there. Avril, thank you very much.
Of course, Elena, and we can't wait to hear a bit more later. But let me turn now to Alison to get into the nitty-gritty of the financial structure. We're going to share now one slide with you so that we can see that in the screen, and Alison can go over the financial structure of this bond. Alison, over to you.
Thank you, Avro. And for everybody that was missing PowerPoints, this will give you enough to hold you over while we go through the panel discussion, which is really what we gain the most out of. And hopefully many of you will get down there to see these wonderful sites and meet the communities and others, as Eleanor and Nick had mentioned. But real quick here on this structure, and a lot of the credit goes to not only our Treasury colleagues, but the GEF and the other partners, including Credit Suisse and others who have been involved with this for a long time. But, I think to answer Avril's first question there, right? Why did we make this work? And I think Valerie and others alluded to this as well. It wasn't easy, right? And it takes a lot of different iterations. And we had many colleagues who were working on this concept over the years. And, as Faye mentioned, you can have a risk on the principal amount. Okay, you can have risk on your return or potential return. And then you can also have other risks tied to foreign exchange and some other things, right, that could be there. So in this case, I think that one of the key factors, it was really, the Treasury issuing this AAA rated bond, okay, which is principal protected. So this is the 150 million shown there on the top right of this screen, and investors willing to buy that bond. Okay, so the bank having this, several decades long experience and track record of issuing bonds in the market and having a very, I would say, robust demand for the different bonds that have been issued, including the green bonds and the many others that have been issued over the years, was key. And then, as opposed to another entity that perhaps didn't have as long of a track record or as extensive of investor base, et cetera, that could have been, a big factor. And then the other key piece was, the GEF, that on the left side, it has this 13.76 million conservation success payment. This is key to having an outcome, okay, that was there to provide the return to investors, okay? So just in a quick, call it 30-second overview, how it works, and then I'll dissect it a little bit more, and then Faye is going to go into more details after me. Basically, on March 31st, the World Bank Treasury settled this bond for 150 million. We have a set of investors, including institutional investors, high net worth individuals, and others who bought this, mainly from the US and Europe. And then they're willing to, take the risk on a return that's tied to rhino growth. Okay, this black rhino growth at the two parks, as Eleanor and Nick have mentioned. So this is really kind of the critical piece, which, investors, they're very, savvy. They're used to running their models and assessing probabilities of return, et cetera. And in this case, it's a new variable, right? It's biodiversity. And when, we got involved with the project, this was the Rhino Bond. And then the first thing I mentioned was, hey, we should call this the wildlife bond because, obviously applies to a lot more than just rhinos. And investors don't have in their, call it, even ESG investors don't have in their portfolio something that's tied to a rhino. They do have potentially something to nature or environmental efficiency or something else. But at the end of the day, it's a wildlife bond, but it should be called a nature bond, right? Because that's how we want to make sure that we grow this market and have these opportunities. But again, the key pieces here was the GEF, once they came in as the outcome payment, they only pay if there are independently verified results after 5 years. And then also the investors who are willing to buy equivalent to $150 million, okay, of a bond, which in many ways, this is certainly not as liquid as a normal plain vanilla IBRD bond. So these investors are taking a risk, okay, that they will get their money back, the 150 million that's, guaranteed by the bank, and it comes from the bank's balance sheet. And then this, potential return, which comes from the Global Environment Facility, the GEF. And what they give up is for 5 years, they do not get any return on their investment, right? No income, no coupon payment as they normally would. But that money, what we're calling here on the middle of the screen there, diverted investor coupons, that goes to these two parks. Okay, so Addo and Great Fish, they receive this money. And as Valerie mentioned, a big thing that is very important here is that the Treasury colleagues, they structure this according to the needs of the parks. So the parks immediately when the bond was issued, okay, and it settled, so on March 31st, they received in their bank accounts for this project 20% of the total funds. Okay, so out of those 152 million rands, which is a little over $10 million, depending on the exchange rate, which has fluctuated a lot over the last couple of years. But basically that money is guaranteed. So over 5 years, they're going to get 152 million rands. That's divided up by the two parks, and about almost 50% of that comes within the first 12 months of the project, right? So whereas a lot of other projects, they have to wait until getting that money towards the end when you can really show the results, et cetera. Here, they get a lot of the money up front so that they can invest in those conservation efforts that will hopefully reach that growth expectation. And very important here is that we have an excellent calculation agent in Conservation Alpha. And then we also have one additional partner with verification agent, which I'm not sure if it's shown here, but it's Zoological Society of London, who, they've also done a fantastic job over the years on getting this project here to this level. And then it's great that they've stayed engaged as a verification agent for this. So at the end of the day, the money that the investors are going to get back in 5 years is going to be the 150 million principal, as well as, there's different tranches of payout, but potentially all of that 13.76 million, if it's verified that the growth of Rhino is above 4%. So that goes back to the investors. And the parks, they actually just signed a grant agreement with the bank and also a transfer agreement for the funds from the investors as foregone coupon payments going to the parks there over the 5 years. And our legal colleague there, Jorge, from the South Africa office, was really instrumental in putting that together, working with Sharmila and the rest of the team. So, again, all of this was thanks to the investment that the parks have made in their monitoring capacity over the years, and obviously having a very strong asset there that they were able to, in this case, package it and access a new market. So this is what an overview of the of the structure itself, but just to emphasize that again, the bank issues the bond. It uses the 150 million to fund its regular SDG activities. Okay, so it goes to bank budget, and then in 5 years, if you get these verified growth rates, then the funds will go. And we had to keep it very simple for make sure that everybody understood it internally and externally. But basically, if Rhino grows in 5 years, investors get a return. And if it grows past that 4% or higher rate, they get a premium on what a plain, vanilla IBRD of 5 years would have provided. So market rates, obviously they change a lot, and we issued this at the, core of the war, right, when that was breaking out. So markets were fluctuating a lot then. So it was great that, again, some very marquee investors came in and were very committed to this. And I have to say that, thanks to Rudy and the German environmental ministry there, they provided some very significant support to ensure that we had as much of the funds going to the parks and the communities, and we were still able to provide the very robust monitoring evaluation that was required for this structure, so that the investors would have that verification, the data needed. So let me stop here, but
Yes.
hopefully that covered it.
Thank you, Alison. That was an excellent explanation of the overall structure. We have some questions I see popping up, but let me hold on to the next slide, because I think a lot of the questions are going to be responded by Faye and his intervention about what does that mean? What did the investors get, and what does the actual success payment, so let me rephrase this a little bit, with a capital guarantee. So 100% of the principal is guaranteed by or guaranteed, I would say, getting a AAA rating from the issuer. And then that's a very good type of peace of mind for investors. But then there's a potential payout, a success payment that depends purely on the annualized Rhino growth rate. And here, Faye, you can explain how does that work for investors.
Sure, thank you. I see there's quite a few questions in the chat about the bond, but yeah, let me use the slide to explain the structure a little more. So from the investor's perspective, at the issuance, they pay an issue price of 94.84%. That's the price they pay, and that issuance proceeds in total is about 142 million. That's the 94.8% price times 150 million principal size. That proceeds went directly to IBRD. So IBRD used that proceeds for our general pool. So that means we use that to support lendings to our client countries, and part of that is going to be used to support, let's say, liquidity investment that we have to keep in our balance sheet. So those proceeds certainly are revenue generating, and that's the reason why we, as an issuer, we can guarantee not only to pay back investors the 94.84, but we pay them the 100% principal back at the end of the 5 years. So this part, it's actually very similar or the same as what we do in a regular bond, where we borrow from investors, we use that for our general operation purpose, and we pay back investors on the maturity date. And that part, the issue price plus the principal redemption at par in 5 years, that itself, from the slides at the bottom line, you can see that implies a return of 1.06% per annum from the investor's perspective. So if there's nothing from the Rhino growth rate success payment perspective, they at least will be making 1.06% return by holding on to this bond. Now, what if we are taking away the entire bond issuance proceeds, then where is the money coming from in terms of the money to the parks? So from the table, you can see the investors are giving up the coupons. The bond pays 0 coupon to the investor. So what that means is that the coupon that investors give up, which we usually pay investors, we then will pay to the parks. So the total amount we're paying to the park is 152 million South African ZARD, South African rand. So in other words, you can think of this economically as if investors, if they hold a regular bond which pays coupon to them, investor would say, no, instead of paying coupon to me, please channel the coupon to the 2 parks. Let them use the money to protect the rhinos there. That's economically the same arrangement here for the bond. Now, then the next question is, if investors are giving up coupons, they're only, in a minimum case, they're only getting 1.06% return back. Why are they doing this? The reason why they're doing this is that it's because of the success payment or the outcome payment that GEF provides. As you see from the left side of the slide, that there is a whole range of Rhino growth rate that is used in a bond to determine the final success payment. And if the Rhino growth rate per annum is more than 4% at the end of the 5 year, there is an additional success payment to the investors. That's the 13.76 million Alison referred to in a previous slide, but from the percentage perspective, it's about 9% total return that investors is going to receive. This is 9% one-time payment to investors on the maturity date. Now, in that scenario, investors are going to get $109 back on the par, and that translates to a yield of 2.83% per annum from the investor's perspective. Why is that attractive? I mean, that is actually almost about 50 basis points more than what we would pay in a 5-year regular bond we issue at a time. So in other words, investors are taking the Rhino growth rate risk or the project risk, but they get compensated. That compensation is about 50 basis points on top of the regular bond that it does not have the rhino risk. Now, obviously, there's other scenarios there. In the second scenario, between 2 and 4%, the success payment will be less because there's a less growth rate in the rhinos. In that case, investor get 2.49%. Now, the 2.49% is about to get into the break even of what investor would get otherwise by holding a regular IBRD bond. And the other scenario where rhino growth rate is 2% or less, that's where investor would actually suffer a loss relative to them using the money to buy just a regular IBRD bond. So I hope it's clear from the structure that there's sort of a different flow of the funds. The initial proceeds come to IBRD, therefore where there's a way for us to guarantee the return of the full principal. And it's the coupons that the investors are giving up that are used to fund the rhino conservation operations at the two parks. And how does that work in the rising interest rate environment? That's the other question. Obviously, if the interest rate is higher, and the regular IBRD bond would pay a higher coupon rate. What that means is that for the same 150 million principal size of the bond, the coupon that investors are giving up is going to be more. So if we were to do this today for 150 million principal size, the amount of money that we can mobilize to the parks would be more than 152 million ZAR. Or in other words, if we target 152 million ZAR as a target, then we don't need 150 million size. We could do it, let's say 110 or 120 million roughly with today's interest rate. So rising interest rate actually means the value of the coupon the investor gives up is more. So potentially it could be more efficient for the structure to work out.
Okay, let me hear if it give perhaps or tell the people in the chat and the questions that we have a Q&A session at the end. You are presenting and at the same time responding, which is great, so that we don't need to come back later. But I would just want to make sure that we still have the time to go back to the parks to cover some of the questions before we can enter the Q&A session, if that is okay. And I also saw there was a question from Carlos Manuel to be asked to the parks directly. And since we've covered some of the Q&A in the chat, Carlos Manuel, if you wanted to come in now.
Yes, sure.
Yes.
Sure, Abrilda, and thanks everybody. Faye, Elisonda, Nick, Eleanor. Very, very interesting. As you can understand, I got a lot of interest in knowing what is the ground impact in terms of the park management and the species management. But my main interest is the political implications of grounding this new instrument, because at this point the global negotiations on CBD are very complicated. We got a lockdown, so to speak, on the political negotiations, and everything is related to the finances of biodiversity and agreement within all parties. One thing that I have seen is that those CBD negotiators are unable to really capture everything that is being done at the country level in terms of mobilizing domestic resources more innovatively or more efficiently. So I wonder, Nick and Eleanor, if the effort that you're doing in your parks within sand parks is coming up to the CBD negotiator from South Africa, and if that is having an impact. Because most CBD negotiators are not able to really understand what is happening on all different fronts at the country level with regards to mobilizing domestic resources or new financial resources, which will give probably a better environment in that overall political negotiation. So I'm wondering if this project, this initiative is being looked or has any influence on how South Africa and the government is negotiating the CBD. Thanks.
I'm going to give the floor to Eleanor. Need to try to respond to this question first.
Thanks, Avril. yeah, it will be difficult for us to, for me anyway, to be able to answer a question like that. I think we as Sandparks, as well as ECPTA, will all report to the Department of Environmental Affairs, Fisheries and Forestry in South Africa, and they're definitely on board with the whole project, and they're fully aware of the project, and they've been aware with the project from the onset of the project, and I think everyone, not just in South Africa, or not just from government side, is looking on this project to see how it can benefit, probably not only for conservation, but for an array of other departments within South Africa. It would have most probably been better for someone from the ministry to be able to answer this question from a political side, as we're not so much involved in that. But the ministry is fully aware of this. How it will fit in with all the CBDs and those, I'm not 100% sure, but they are fully aware of the project, and has been so from the onset, even in the impact in the readiness phase, in the Rhino impact investment bond phase. So they're fully aware of it. I'm not sure from Eleanor's side if she can maybe add to any of that.
Thank you, Nick. Avril, I will add. Nick is correct. We can't speak categorically on whether or not this will be discussed at the CBD. But what I did want to pick up on, Carlos, was linked to the political impact that this has had. What we can say is when the negotiations and discussions initially started linked to this potential opportunity for South Africa, the politicians mobilized quite effectively. Within a space of 1 year, we suddenly got a couple of million rand to create a bit of a baseline for Great Fish River Nature Reserve, for us to be in the investment readiness phase, to be able to qualify for this project. So it is very important to really recognize that impact. When the politicians understood that, okay, we need to perhaps divert resources from elsewhere that we wouldn't have usually diverted, but for us to play our part as South Africa to partake in this novel idea, that is then what happened. And I must share this, colleagues, that was a paradigm shift for the province of the Eastern Cape. And our whole country, obviously, the other provinces are looking at this project in the Eastern Cape, because both Great Fish River Nature Reserve and Addo, we are in the Eastern Cape. So the politicians in the Eastern Cape, they are watching this project, and maybe it's a bit premature, but they are already starting to brag about the fact that they are part of this novel project. We're going to make it work. It's going to be a success. We are all going to stand together. Let's show people that together we can do more. Politically, that is something that we've struggled with as a country. That is a huge, huge impact that you cannot quantify, but it is massive for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor and Nick. And precisely that was my intention, Eleanor, to be able to understand how this new financial instrument helps the country in those domestic and international political challenges. Let me do an offer here, Abril, if you allow me, with Eleanor and Nick, and yes, of course, all of our colleagues. The GEF is having a very nice pavilion in COP15. I will very much like to invite you all to have a Rhino event during COP15, you know, but something very similar to what we're doing over there, but in the context of the COP. So it is open. This is an open invitation to all of you to join us and organize an event during the COP. Thank you, Abril.
This is fantastic news, Carlos. Carlos Manuel, we will be working on that, and we will make our best efforts to have Eleanor and Nick there to bring the perspective from the ground, because that's when, you know, on the one hand, with the bond issuance, we got it was the finish line for the bond issuance per se, but it was the starting line for all of the conservation effort that needs to happen in the next 5 years to get to the results of rhino population growth that we all look forward to. So before opening, I really want to open it to Q&A. So I had a bit more questions to ask our panelists, but let me just go to one that was already asked by Valerie Hickey and that I'm also very interested, they somewhat touched upon it, but I want to hear from all the panelists. How repeatable and scalable is this for each of your organizations? So is this scheme repeatable for these specific species, for other species? What do you think? And the answer, of course, from where you stand from each of your organizations. I'm going to start with Eleanor first.
Thank you, Avril. We believe that this approach can really be tailored to almost any conservation challenge, to be honest. Now that we understand the ins and outs and how it works, it took a while for Ellison to explain to us how it works, but when we got it, we got it. So thank you, Ellison. So we understand that all that is really required is that you have a clear theory of change, you know what needs to be done, you link it to a budget, you have clear targets, you're able to monitor what's happening, and you can show what the outcome will be. So the current project is for 5 years long, the current Wildlife Conservation Bond project. And this would allow us to build on what has been achieved in the 5 years if this project can be replicated at Great Fish. So we're talking about sustainability and having potentially another 5 years just to capitalize on the gains of the first 5 years. But secondly, we've critically looked at our other protected areas in the province. And there's a reason why I am saying that, colleagues. We are running out of space in South Africa to start new rhino populations. But that's not entirely true. We are running out of areas that has the correct management and security features to relocate our surplus animals to. So the idea that we would like to definitely advocate for is that this project gets replicated elsewhere in the country into ecosystems that lends itself to this very idea that we are currently piloting at Addo and at Great Fish. And then lastly, simple example, but wild dog, for example, also a species at risk. Lots of habitat for it, but not necessarily the security features and the management interventions, the resources to do that. So I'm just using that example as an example for maybe another species that colleagues would know around the table. So definitely replicable for rhino conservation, but definitely for other species as well, if you are able to demonstrate growth, demonstrate protection, report appropriately, etc., have checks and balances in place. Then I'd like to push the envelope a little bit, Avril, to say I'm not a marine specialist, but it's worthwhile for us to look at the marine side of things as well. I strongly believe that if we do the baseline work there, it could potentially be replicable within the marine protected area system as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor. For the other speakers, 1 minute answer, please. We want to open it to the Q&A. So Ellison, next.
Thank you, April. And I think the short answer is absolutely. Just in the last few weeks, I mean, we've had talks and various detailed discussions with, you know, colleagues from Ministry of Finance and central banks and many others across, you know, China, Malaysia, in Latin America, several countries in Africa. So the appetite is so large. And I think, you know, even though for us that we were struggling with this daily, right? In reality, once we got involved and from our concept note review, which was April of 2020 until the bond was issued in March 2022, that's 2 years, right? And the parks got 20% of their funding right when it was issued. So in some ways it is a painful process, but you know, it could be much, much easier. From concept to the decision meeting by the country director, that was only 6 months. In this case, because it was the first time we were doing this, we had to go through all of the highest levels of review within the organization, all the way up to the president. So, you know, a future one does not have to do that. And thanks to our lawyers here, we have a very good template for, you know, the grant agreement as well as this, you know, transfer agreement. And the Treasury, they continue to have that very good track record and this investor appetite, right? So now we have a very strong demand from the clients that they're still in a similar situation regarding, you know, a difficult fiscal and macro condition. And, you know, they need to protect their conservation and to meet their biodiversity targets as well as their climate targets, which, if you think about it, you know, this is a very cost-effective instrument, okay? And, you know, yes, there are questions about how much time it takes, how much does it cost to get the monitor, et cetera. And I think we will just improve. I mean, think of, you know, the Teslas when they came out, right? And now the cost is just solar panels, right? You're just trying to push it down and make it a commodity. And in reality, to the extent that we can have this be an add-on, where the clients, they invest in their monitoring capacity, really understanding what assets they have available and what the market's willing to pay for them, right? And that price should just increase over time because these goods, and I see John Robinson is here on the screen, but they've done some wonderful papers around, you know, call it, you know, there's going to be a race to a point where, you know, eventually the biodiversity could, you know, pick up again, right? But until we get there and we figure out how to price these and how to, you know, support it through grants, which again, unless these projects do have cash flow, you know, it's hard to tie that cash flow to a return to investors. They will need some grants to support it. So, yeah. Sorry, go ahead, April.
Let me stop you there. We are running out of time, and I want to hear also from Nick and Faye. But thank you. I keep you absolutely as an answer. And we're happy that there's so much interest. So let me turn now to Nick and Faye, please, a very short intervention. We need to actually turn to our communications colleagues very soon. And it's let me see what we can do with the Q&A in a second. So Nick, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Avril. Yeah, in short and sweet, I think Eleanor has said it most. In the South African National Park system, outside of Kruger, Rhino are bursting the seams, and we need to look to expand in other areas. So I think it will be definitely be able to looking at partnerships between state, province, and private partnerships to see how we can expand this project. And then obviously with the project that can do it. And then I can't agree more with the marine side of it. Addo is a large marine protected area we're managing. It is a massive decline in the African penguin, and something like that would also be able to assist a species like that, which would probably be long extinct before the rhino. Thanks, Avril.
Thank you, Nick. And Faye.
Yeah, very quickly, from my perspective, I think the structure is certainly replicable for the future. And there's a couple components that I want to emphasize here. In addition to having an outcome pair, certainly a suitable project with track record so that investor can clearly understand the risk, that can at least have some measure of the risk and the clear reporting and the measurement mechanism that is not overcomplicated, that is easy to implement. That those are the key things. And then there's one more thing is the involvement of either GEF or IBRD, because there needs to be the right incentive. There's the monitoring and surveillance there that will give investors the comfort that somebody is watching out for the development of the project over the life, so that they could also have a peace of mind having their investment going to the parks and having the assurance that the money will be used in the right way to produce, hopefully, the success that they are targeting to achieve.
Thank you, Faye, and thanks to our panelists for this very in-depth discussion of the transaction. I'm afraid we do not have the time for Q&A on the open floor, but I thank my panelists for being very active in the chat and responding at the same time as these questions have been asked. We will do our best to, first of all, we will share the materials with the participants and maybe respond to the questions in an email to the participants, those questions that haven't been addressed yet. I just wanted to conclude this panel by thanking all of our panelists, Eleanor and Nick, from the South African parks for joining us today and sharing what has been a long journey and the beginning, as I said, of a very nice, what we expect to be a very nice 5 years of work to ensure the conservation of these species and ensure at the end of the day a good payout of the rhino. If we could share just a picture of the team on the ground, that Ellison was just there very recently and had the starting workshop with the various parks on the ground. This is what the capital markets transaction looks on the ground. All of these people and many more, as Ellison has mentioned many times during the webinar, have been and are part of the success of this transaction. So with this, thank you so much to Ellison and to Faye for your patience and your very detailed explanations. We will now turn to our colleagues in the communications team, Laura McKinney and Laura Ivers, to explain what has been the global outreach and impact of this bond, what was the worldwide reception and how this was received worldwide. So go ahead, I'm going to give the word to Laura and to Laura, two Lauras.
Thank you, everyone. You have two Lauras for the price of one today, so it's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm just going to say a few words. I'm Laura McGinnis from the GEF Communications team. I'll turn over to my colleague Laura Ivers from the World Bank in just a moment. We wanted to share with you a little bit of the results of the announcement of the outreach related to the bond, and also a little bit about the approach. So we worked very closely with our operational team well before the announcement occurred, to prepare and make sure that we were all aligned across lots of partners. There was media interest in this transaction, a year before it happened or even more. So, there was, tremendous interest and lots to align. And I think the main thing I wanted to say is that, we had goals to support the successful launch, to describe this as an example, showcase it as an example of how to innovate around finance mobilization for biodiversity. I think the third goal was also just to explain, as Valerie said, explain how it happened, like really the components of it, how that magic was made. For the GEF, that really involved explaining a specific role related to the performance payment and to the risk reduction. And we did that through like a very collaborative, very positive engagement over months, if not longer. So, we've been working together. We'll continue to work together towards the COP in Montreal and otherwise looking for other opportunities to describe this and to build on it in the future. So we had a very positive engagement throughout. And I'll pass it over to Laura to describe some of the results that we had.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Laura, for that introduction. So I have some slides that I prepared just to give some visuals on the results. So we can go to the next slide, please. And then actually, Laura McGinnis just nicely explained this, so we'll keep moving forward. So, in addition to having this very timely, innovative, interesting work to present through the launch and this committed, well-coordinated team that several people have remarked on, and the good partners, what we also developed was a very good package of materials, which is always core to a successful launch. So there are several links in the invite to this event that take you to the materials that we prepared. So if you haven't had a chance to look at them, I encourage you to just do that. Very critical elements are the press release and the social media package, and then that drives audiences to the materials that then go into greater depth, the feature story, the video, frequently asked questions. And if you go to the next slide, we also had an infographic that provided quick at a glance information to audiences. And then continuing to the next slide, we also had 4 websites that were featuring the content, and this is to reach the different audiences with slightly differentiated messaging. So we had the World Bank page, we had the World Bank Africa page, and then also the environment page, and then the GEF page. So customizing to the audiences that follow those groups. And then on to the next slide, please. So then this is about the press release. And so this was something that we did carefully develop and negotiate in the lead up to the launch. It took several weeks of preparing this. And if you click, there's more images that will come up on this. So you can see there's very impressive level quotes here. We have from ministers, we have from CEOs, and we also have from the World Bank Group president. And the press release was viewed more than 6,300 times within the first week. And just that's about 3 times greater than what we normally see for a press release. So that just goes to show how much interest there was in this topic. We did also use different channels to get the press release out, including through partners, and that probably also helped with the reach. Now, going to the next slide, we got some pretty impressive pickup from that. Worldwide, there were 430 media stories within the first couple of weeks. I know I still get calls, so there's still interest that's coming in, just at a slightly slower pace. And then to give an idea of what this type of pickup means, I'll just point to Reuters and Bloomberg that are featured on this slide. These are outlets where the reach is 37.5 million. So if you sort of tally up, and that reach number can be a little tricky to use because that means like potential viewers, we don't know that everybody read and absorbed the content, but once you add up the potential reach of those 430 stories, you get hundreds of millions and into the billions actually. So a good result. And then moving on to the next slide, we also featured some great coverage from a wonderful blog by April, just to highlight that as well, showing the importance of the individual channels that we used. And then going on to the next slide. This summarizes on the previous slide, there was also a bit on the social media. And you can see also here that we got very significant reach with nearly 10,000 engagements. By now, I'm sure it's actually higher. And that was also using multiple channels, the GEF and the World Bank and leadership mentions like this one here featured by David Malpass, and then also from influencers like Conservation International, UNDP. We had a lot of pickup from partners. So then moving on to the next slide. So you can see here, just this is also useful to see in terms of the reach. This is the Instagram channel for the World Bank, and then also our Twitter feed, where you can see that gets 1.7 million followers alone. So once you add up all those 10,000 instances of social media, it ends up being a very broad reach. So with that, I would just close by saying that there is a lot of opportunity going forward. It's nice to hear about the pavilion at COP15. There will be interest from stakeholders to see how the bond fares. So we will have to keep the communications efforts going. And then also many thanks to the technical team being so engaged with the communications colleagues from the start, as Laura mentioned, because I think that made all the difference. This was a really great project to work on. So with that, back to you, April, with 1 minute to close. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And Laura, it was pretty amazing actually to see all that interest when it happened back in March. Thank you so much for all your work and creativity and all the materials created and the outreach. And now we're reaching the end of the webinar, but I wanted to give before that the word to Claude Gascon, the manager of the programs unit here at the GEF Secretariat, for saying goodbye, and thank you for participating. So Claude, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Avril, and thanks to everybody who participated in today's brown bag session. I think just following up on the communications piece, this has been the most popular BBL we've had in the past several years. I think we hit a number of 133 participants at the peak. It's even more popular than the brown bag that we had just a couple of weeks ago on the Amazon Sustainable Landscape. So rhinos are more popular than the Amazon, which for me, having worked many years in the Amazon, is a bit of a surprise, but I guess they are warm and cuddly. So thanks to everybody. This has really been a truly unique opportunity to gather all of the partners on this project, including, of course, the World Bank operations and Treasury teams, colleagues from the South Africa National Parks, our colleagues from the communications teams, and of course the GEF Secretariat. This project is the result of a collective effort to structure and implement and disseminate a truly innovative financial product, as we've seen. The Rhino Bond, or the Wildlife Conservation Bond, is an example of a collaboration across institutions resulting in an attractive investment opportunity, but more importantly, for my perspective, and I'm sure many of yours, one that will lead to true conservation gains. We shouldn't forget that the result of the GEF investment will grow the rhino populations, but also benefit local communities. It will also support staff in the national parks and the work they do, as well as make investments in equipment, infrastructure, and technology. The project is indeed timely to fill funding gaps, as we've heard, due to the reduction in tourism during the pandemic, and also will help support a green recovery post-COVID and perhaps serve as an example in this respect. We're very proud and encouraged by the innovative and collaborative nature of this project, and we're hopeful that we would be able to scale up and replicate this effort in other species and geographies. We'll continue to seek opportunities to support other innovative financial mechanisms and harness the private sector and its financing for environmental protection, like we've seen in the Wildlife Conservation Bond. And just a reminder, it was mentioned at the beginning of this session that the GEF, under the leadership of Carlos Manuel, has just completed a very successful and record replenishment. So we have a fresh pot of money that Avril is now sitting on to entertain more of these types of innovative projects. So thanks again for your participation. Special thanks to Avril, Tion, and Mia, some of my colleagues who have organized this session in a very professional fashion. And I hope to see all of you in a future BBL session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.